One of the motivations for the lawsuit was discrimination against Asian American students.
My understanding is that the lawsuit was primarily brought because of the Asian discrimination question.
So what are your main findings then? So strictly, if we focus then on...
If you are Asian American at Harvard, then on average, you face a 20% penalty. Yeah, so you see a very sizable racial preference for the underrepresented minority groups, and then a smaller but still pretty large penalty for Asian Americans.
Yeah.
My name is Tyler Ransom. I'm an economics professor at the University of Oklahoma. I do work in higher education, labor economics, and regional and urban economics, and this is the Cause and Effect podcast.
So today we're going to discuss discrimination in college admissions. Tyler has a lot of work in this area, and I'm very excited to chat with him about this. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Vitor. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so before we even get to discrimination or college admissions in general, you use very unique data in your research, right? So in various papers that you have, it's a very unique data set. A lot of evidence that became available because of a recent Supreme Court case. Can you tell us a little bit about that Supreme Court case, how it evolved over time, and what should listeners know about that in order to understand your study?
Yeah, so this was more than 10 years ago. An organization called Students for Fair Admissions, they sued Harvard College and University of North Carolina, claiming that there was discrimination on the basis of race in their admissions decisions for their undergraduate programs. And so as a result of the lawsuit, there was expert witnesses hired on both sides, and a lot of documents were produced about the admissions process at these two universities. And so that's kind of where the data lies for the papers that I've published with my collaborators. But then also, that case finally made it through all of the appeals processes and ended up at the Supreme Court in the fall of 2022. And then in June of 2023, the court ruled against Harvard. And so they kind of combined the cases when they got to the Supreme Court. And so the court ruled against the defendants and in favor of the plaintiffs, and said that, racial preferences in university admissions are not constitutional.
What kind of evidence became available because of the Supreme Court decision? Or actually because of the Supreme Court case. So a lot of people have been interested in understanding discrimination in college admissions, or just, how decisions are being made. But a lot of those data are very difficult to find. It seems like most universities don't really share that. But what kind of information was made available then because of this case?
So one critical piece of information that was not made available was the actual applications, of everyone that applied. So there's no micro data. That's what we would call micro data in the economics business. So that stuff is not available, but you can kind of piece together a lot of pieces of evidence from descriptive statistics in the expert witness reports, from regression output that's reported in the different reports. There's also a fair amount of legal discovery that unearthed internal communications, internal memos about, and internally generated reports that also had a wealth of information.
So what did you guys have in mind before you got access to this information? So what kind of questions were you guys thinking of? How were you thinking about those questions?
I mean, I think, a lot of it was just learning about the case. So one of my collaborators was one of the expert witnesses. And so his name's Peter Arcidiacono. He was the expert witness for the Students for Fair Admissions side. And so he knew a lot about the things and was thinking about them. I think, at the time he was working on the case, and thought, this would be interesting to explore more. And so, I think as far as Harvard goes, people were very interested in whether legacy admissions what's the size of the preferential treatments that they give to legacies. And for listeners who are unfamiliar, that's students who are applying to Harvard whose parents graduated from Harvard. So we call those legacies. And also the extent to which there might be preferential treatment for people who are connected to big-time donors to Harvard. So if my uncle pays for a building for the engineering school or whatever, is that going to get me into Harvard, even if I don't have the best grades and test scores? So I think those were kind of, in retrospect, that's what's hit the biggest chord out of the stuff that we've released. But then, there's also the question of like, there, for a long time running up to the case, there was this folk wisdom or folk belief that Asians were discriminated against at Harvard. And so that was another angle that was a big part of the case that also was interesting to academic researchers as well as policymakers. And then also just like what's the extent of preferences given to racial minorities as well.
So you look at various different racial groups, right? So let's start talking about them one at a time. So it seems like one of the motivations for the lawsuit was discrimination against Asian American students, right?
That's right.
Was that the main part of the lawsuit? So before we even talk about the results there, or was that just one of the many things that played a role?
My understanding is that the lawsuit was primarily brought because of the Asian discrimination question and also the preferences for the underrepresented minority groups. So those as a whole, you could just say as racial preferences, and if it's not a plus factor, then it's a negative, and you call it discrimination, but it's all the same thing. So you could say Harvard has a negative racial preference for Asian Americans. That would be equivalent to saying Harvard discriminates against Asian Americans. The lawsuit could not have focused on legacies or donors because those aren't constitutionally protected groups in the same way that.
So let's assume you got all the data now, right? So as soon as you got all the information and you got data on the admissions, or at least admissions decisions, right? How would you approach answering that question? So if we want to know, if an Asian student that looks very similar, for example, to a white student, how much more likely is one versus another, for example, to be accepted? How would you approach that question then?
Well, you can kind of approach it in different levels of complexity. So at the face value, you can just sort applications into different bins based on how strong is their grades and test scores. So you could say, give me 10 bins. I'm going to take every application. I'm going to put it into 1/10 of the total distribution. And, if it's in the lowest 10th, then I'm going to put it in the farthest left bin. If it's in the highest 10th, I'm going to put it in the farthest right bin. And I just sort all the applications there. And then I look at, okay, what's the admit rate for these different groups conditional on being in bin 10 or bin 5 or whatever. So, Harvard claims, and I should say we're probably going to be spending most of the time talking about Harvard because that's where kind of a lot of the attention was. That's where a lot of the interest is. And the UNC, UNC's process is quite a bit different. It's a public university. It's not as selective. So, just speaking mostly about Harvard, Harvard purports to have what they call a holistic admissions process, which basically means they get lots and lots of applications from really highly qualified people, and they're going to have to choose somehow which ones to admit. So you could think of Harvard's admissions process as being, we get twice as many applicants that are perfectly qualified to be here as we have seats. And so we need to figure out a way to choose the ones that we're going to actually have enrolled. So that's just a little bit about Harvard's process, but they also keep track of the grades and test scores as kind of like a standard variable that they can use to compare different applicants pretty quickly. So they call that the academic index. And so you can basically divide up the academic index into these 10 bins, like I was saying, and then look at what's the composition of race within each bin, and what's the likelihood of an applicant from each racial group or ethnic group being admitted, given whatever bin that I'm looking at. And so just that preliminary bin sorting analysis, there's no fancy statistics. You're just literally just sorting applicants and counting up and computing percentages of admission. So that alone, you start to see pretty drastic summary statistics, pretty drastic outcome differences, even just looking at the academic index alone, which we know is not all of what Harvard cares about, but that's kind of an initial step. And then another kind of crucial piece of the admissions process. So if you're going to model admissions at a university, you need to do quite a bit of reading about how the admissions office makes decisions. So at Harvard, they have different admissions officers read the applications. They call them readers. And they're going to grade the application and give like scores from 1 to 5, with 1 being the highest, in 5 different dimensions. So they're going to give it an academic rating, an extracurricular rating, a personal rating, an athletic rating, and an overall rating. And so that's how they grade the applications. If you look at UNC, you're going to see something pretty similar, but every place, I think, kind of has their own different formula and different way of doing it. So at UNC, they're going to grade the essay. They're going to grade how difficult was your high school curriculum versus how well did you do on that curriculum. And they're going to grade your personality, not personality, but personal qualities. What's your potential for leadership or being a good citizen on campus. UNC doesn't have an athletic rating the way that Harvard does. So instead, they'll do like an essay rating, whereas Harvard doesn't directly grade the essay. But then Harvard also has other ratings for like, what did your high school teacher that wrote the letter of recommendation say about you? And also the guidance counselor at your school, what did they say about you? So there's all these different ratings. And so another thing you could do is just say, okay, well, give me everybody who got a really high score on the academic rating at Harvard. And now let's just look at the applications that are in that bin. So, the way it works is like pretty much less than 1% of people get a 1, which is like the highest rating. And so basically you say 1s and 2s are kind of one group, and then 3s, 4s, 5s are another group. And you can kind of look at all these ratings and you can see, okay, well, what's the racial or ethnic distribution that's in this group? And then what was the admissions chances for that group being in that bin? And that's kind of like that. Sorry, one more thing. So that's kind of just thinking about the thing more holistically. So, maybe one group is a lot better at academics and not as great at athletics or personality, personal rating or whatever. And so then that's kind of what the rationale is there.
So there are a lot of different ratings, right? It sounds like. And which of those do you think could be affected by race, and which of those do you think could not? So for example, the academic rating, right? Is it as simple as looking at GPAs and test scores and just having some kind of formula that gives you a weighting? Or is there some elements of subjectivity there? And how does that compare to other ratings where there might be more elements of subjectivity or less?
Yeah, so the way that you would assess that, or at least one way that we did, was let's just look at those academic index, those 10 bins of academic index, and let's just look at okay, if you were in academic index bin 10, meaning you had the highest grades and test scores, then how likely were you to get a 1 or a 2 on the academic rating? So it's kind of like a validation exercise. Now, there's more stuff that goes into the academic rating than goes into the academic index. And so it's not going to be like a perfect fit, but you can at least observe, are there any differences in the likelihood of getting a 1 or a 2 on the academics if I'm in those top tiers of the on the academic index. I think I just said academic rating, but hopefully that's clear. And so from that standpoint, you don't see very many racial differences in that relationship between which of the 10 bins am I in versus did I get a high academic rating. But then you can do that same type of analysis. So you could say, well, maybe there's some relationship between doing well on extracurriculars and doing well on academics. So I could do that same type of analysis to see if I'm like in that top set of academic index bins, am I as likely to get a really high extracurricular rating if I'm white versus if I'm Asian American versus if I'm Black or Hispanic, right? So that's kind of the rationale there. And basically what you see from that exercise is that pretty much all the ratings, except for personal and overall, are not, they don't seem to be contaminated with racial preferences. But the personal rating is very much so. So like there's massive differences in the likelihood of getting a 1 or a 2 on the personal rating, given that you're in those top academic index bins based on which race group you are.
Yeah, so the way I'm thinking, or I would think about discrimination is, suppose you got Vitor, suppose Hispanic, what would happen if I was white, or if I was Asian, or if I was Black, and so on. And everything else about me is exactly the same, right? Is that how you guys are thinking about discrimination? What are some potential challenges of estimating that difference, given that I can't just be 4 different races at the same time? So people who are different, there might be, differences even within bins and so on. So what's the challenge there, and how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, so that is where you need a statistical model to come in, and you need to be able to make what economists call holding all else equal, or ceteris paribus comparisons. So we want to know, okay, I have this application, it's got this information on it. I want to keep that same application, but then I want to change the ethnicity to Hispanic from white. So you can't really do that in the real world because you would need to run an experiment, and you can't experiment in the same way you can in other aspects because you're actually having a real Harvard admissions officer read your application. And so you need to just, so if you can't run an experiment, then what can you do? Well, you can just try to get a really well-fitting regression model and then hope that you've sort of overcome any kind of confounding factors by having a predictive enough regression model. So that's what we had to do, because there's really not much else to do in this situation.
So as the idea then of what's going on in the background is that there are a lot of people applying to college, and there might be a lot of people that are very similar. So you have some, 2 people that they're not 100% identical, but they're pretty similar. And then essentially what's going on in the background of that analysis is that you're comparing people who are very similar. And those people who are very similar are going to have differences when they have differences in their race. And then you see how that affect their likelihood of being accepted, for example. Is that a rough way of explaining what's going on in the background there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you're just basically trying to match applications on the factors that you observe. And if you can't match them perfectly, then you have to do a little bit of extrapolation. But hopefully that's not too severe. And then from there you're able to get the effect of race independent of these other factors that might be correlated with race and admissions.
So what are your main findings then? So strictly, if we focus then on, is there discrimination happening and how much of it is happening? What are your main findings?
Yeah, so I don't have the papers in front of me, so you'll have to forgive me if I misquote myself. But if you are Asian American at Harvard, then on average, you face a 20% penalty. So what that means more concretely is that the overall admit rate to Harvard is about 5% in the era that we're measuring it. And the penalty for being an Asian is 1 percentage point lower admissions. And so that constitutes a 20% reduction in the admissions rate. So that's a pretty sizable penalty, given what you see in terms of like the gender gap in wages or other types of discrimination that are studied elsewhere in the literature. As far as the racial preferences, so you see massive racial preferences for blacks and Hispanics, much more so for blacks. So I think, if I remember right, and there's a lot of different ways that you can quantify these things, but basically, if I remember right, the blacks have like a 2.5x higher admissions rate than whites that would be similarly situated whites. And then for Hispanics, I think it's like an 80% increase or something around that. So you see a very sizable racial preference for the underrepresented minority groups, and then a smaller but still pretty large penalty for Asian Americans.
And you talked about the different ratings or indexes that they have. So what are the mechanisms, basically, where does race play a role in those indexes and therefore the likelihood that students might be admitted?
Yeah, so this is where things get a little bit trickier. So a big part of the case was arguing whether or not the personal rating should be used as a factor to match the applications on. Because if it is, then if there's discrimination in the personal rating, then you're sort of going to attribute that discrimination to the personal rating instead of attributing it to the race directly. And so, given what I had said earlier about the differences in the likelihood of getting a high personal rating score, given that you're in those higher bins of academic index, that led us to believe that we should not include the personal rating in the model. And so, basically, if you were to put the personal rating in, then you would sort of cut in half that effect. So basically, half of the Asian American discrimination is occurring through Asian Americans systematically getting lower personal rating scores. And then the other half would just be, Harvard is able to put a lot of different weight on a lot of different factors that may or may not favor the strengths of the Asian American population as a group. And so that's also accounting for some of the penalty as well. But that kind of brings up a more subjective question of like, what should Harvard be putting weight on when they're making their admissions decisions? Because if they only did everything that's academic related and they didn't put any weight on anything that's non-academic, then Harvard's admitted class would be 50% Asian. And so and that's just a function of Asian American applicants are just really, really strong on academics. And so that's going to make it so that they are going to do well under an academics only regime. And so these other factors are sort of there in part to balance out the racial distribution of the incoming class.
Very interesting, because when I first heard about the case, and it's something I've wondered for a while, is, if the goal is to include or give an advantage to minority groups, shouldn't Asians be included in that? Perhaps they should also get a premium, right? But it does, once you start thinking through the implications of what you just said, which is, well, if there wasn't this disadvantage, about half of the student group might be Asian. You can start to think of how, people in admissions might not want that, or might want to change things in a way such that, minority groups are not necessarily the majority of the student body. Do you think that's part of the reason? I mean, now I know we're getting outside of the objective side of this and thinking a little more of the subjective side of what should they be doing, but why do you think there's such a large penalty at Harvard? And do you think this is something unique to Harvard, or because of the crazy amount of applications that they might get, or is that something that you think probably plays a role in a lot of other schools?
Yeah, I mean, so one interesting thing is that UNC doesn't have an Asian penalty, but they do have a pretty similar pattern in terms of blacks getting large racial preferences, Hispanics getting smaller but still pretty large racial preferences. And so, to answer your second question, there's actually, during the tail end of Trump's first administration, the DOJ actually sued Yale on a similar basis as Students for Fair Admissions did to Harvard. And so they produced a similar analysis from Yale in their complaint that did the bin on the academic index type of analysis that I was describing. And you see very, very similar patterns just in terms of how the applications are sorted across the bins by academic index. And so that leads me to believe that this is a more widespread phenomenon than just Harvard. But it's impossible to know without having the micro data for every university. But
at least from the evidence from those two universities, and maybe if we also include what you're describing from Yale, it seems like the very elite universities, perhaps, so, the Ivy, Stanford, and so on, might have something similar to Harvard, and UNC is a little more comparable to other public universities. I know we're just guessing now and we don't know for sure based on the data, but is that kind of what you would expect if you had to guess?
Yeah. And I think one thing that the listeners should understand really well is that the amount of racial preferences that need to be given is inversely related or negatively correlated with the selectivity of the institution. So, where you and I both work at flagship public institutions that are not super highly ranked, they're not badly ranked, but they're not in the elite. So, I don't know what Clemson's admit rate is, but I know that Oklahoma's admit rate is north of 80%. So 4 out of every 5 applicants to OU is going to be admitted. I would expect something similar from Clemson. And so if you're admitting that many people, then there's you're not being selective. And so there can be no very large discrimination because you're just not being selective about anybody. And so really this, the set of schools that has admit rates under 20% is actually not that large. And so this is really only going to be a policy relevant issue at those really selective places. And you could see this in the UNC case, because UNC, they have a rule that they can only admit I think 18% of their admitted class can come from out of state. And so a lot of people want to come to UNC even if they live out of state. And so UNC's out-of-state admissions process is about as competitive as an Ivy League school, whereas its in-state admissions process is much less selective. And so you see that same type of behavior even within those two arms of UNC, where the in-state one has much larger racial preferences, and then the out-of-state one has much larger racial preferences, the in-state one doesn't. And so that just kind of shows this relationship between discrimination and selectivity of the university.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it seems like the highly selective schools are probably more likely to be behaving in this way. But I guess those universities also play a lot of very important people end up going to those universities, right? And they play a big role in the economy in general. I mean, presidents and politicians and all kinds of people in important positions tend to go to a lot of those universities. So, that's just to say how, very important it still is, right? Even if places like, University of Texas, El Paso, they have 99% acceptance rate, right? So we probably don't expect to see a lot of discrimination there. But yeah, so it's very interesting that we get to have that insight, even though the data really comes from two universities. So
yeah, and then to kind of circle back to what we were saying earlier about, what should Harvard put emphasis on in its admissions process. If you're sort of wondering how this holistic process came to be, there's a book called The Chosen by Jerome Carabel that basically walks through how there was high achievement among Jewish applicants in the 1920s. So this is over 100 years ago. Harvard used to just have an entrance exam, and if you could pass the entrance exam, then you were admitted. But then they sort of, Harvard and a lot of the other Ivy League universities, they decided that they didn't want to admit so many Jewish applicants. And so then that's sort of where the holistic admissions criteria got set. And then it's just kind of been an artifact of that history for the last 100 years. So this is the basic argument of that Jerome Carabel book, which I think makes a lot of sense. And then, Malcolm Gladwell released a new book in the last year called Revenge of the Tipping Point, where he talks about this same issue of, what should Harvard be basing their admissions on, and he kind of talks through that history as well. So if anyone out there is listening and is interested in this type of thing, definitely recommend that Gladwell book.
There's at least some sense that if you can get the right score, you can pass through it, and people can overcome those challenges, right? And it's certainly much more difficult for race to play a role, because it's at least assuming that you got two people, again, that idea of discrimination, two people who are identical, meaning they get the same score, they're both as likely to be accepted.
Yeah, my understanding is that the holistic admissions is basically only in the United States, and that almost everywhere else in the world, as far as I understand, uses some kind of centralized system that is just going to base it on an exam score and then give you the institutional match based on that.
Well, yeah. So I'm interested in reading the books and learning more about how that came to be. So in your paper, you talk about how racial preferences disproportionately benefited applicants from more advantaged backgrounds. Can you talk a little bit about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so basically, if you want to understand a little bit more about which Black or Hispanic applicants are receiving the preferences, so you can include some extra factors in your admissions model that track, is this a Hispanic applicant from a low income background or a high income background? Is this a Hispanic applicant who's a legacy or not? And so if you include those extra sort of subgroup factors in your model, then that's going to allow you to see if there's any systematic difference in how sort of upper class and lower class Hispanics are being treated, where I'm just using income or legacy to define class. And at Harvard, they have a a disadvantaged flag on the application. So basically the reader reads the application and then is trying to check, does this person appear to be coming from modest background? And if they are, then they'll say this person is disadvantaged. And so we can use that as like another sub-factor in the model. And then basically what you see is that, yes, there's a big preference for, Black or Hispanic applicants, but that preference is basically cut in half if they're coming from a lower SES background or lower socioeconomic background. And so that was kind of a new finding. I don't think anyone's looked at that level of difference or nuance within the racial preferences anywhere else in the scientific studies that have been published. And you see the same thing with the legacy. So like, Hispanics get a bump, but Hispanic legacies don't get like a double bump. They just get the racial bump. They don't get the legacy bump separate. So you get a bump for being a legacy, you get a bump for being Hispanic, but you don't get an extra bump for being a Hispanic legacy. Yeah, I mean, in the paper, we kind of hypothesize why that might be. I think probably the most reasonable explanation is that you don't want to have too much academic mismatch for your students. So if you were giving out the bump for Hispanic legacy and the double bump for being both, then you might end up with some Hispanics coming in that have very, very low test scores, and then they're not going to be able to catch up to the rest of their peers. Because the thing about racial preferences is, like, by definition, you're changing the admission standard for the different racial groups, and so that's going to result in different groups coming in with different levels of credentials. You're going to have these differences in academic background based on how the admissions process works. And so then, I think that must be why they don't give the double bump, is because they don't want those differences to become too large. You could also tell a story that at a place like Harvard, being from a higher class background is important for, like, integrating yourself with, say, the kids whose parents bought a building, or the kids who are multi-generation legacy. And so if you're admitting lower class or lower SES minorities, then they're going to have a harder time actually benefiting from getting a Harvard education, because a lot of the Harvard education is having these peers that are going to help you get a job later in your career.
So about legacy, so you actually have an entire paper about the effect of being a legacy or an athlete, and how that might affect the enrollment decisions, acceptance decisions, and so can you talk a little bit about what you find there and how that might connect with discrimination in admissions?
Yeah, so the legacies, they get a bump, but it's hard to tease that out just from the raw data, because legacies could just be like really good at the stuff that Harvard values, because they've been groomed from birth to have really high test scores and really good extracurriculars and whatever, right? So you need to do the same type of analysis that I described for the application, the other side of the application, and you need to, you could do the sorting them into the academic index bins and seeing what the rates of admission are for legacies versus non-legacies. You can see what kind of ratings they get, and you can just put them into the model to try to see what the effect is. And I think, if I remember right, the end story was that there's basically like a 14 percentage point bonus for being a legacy once you kind of factor in all these different factors. And so, off a baseline admit rate of 5%, that's a really sizable, that's like a 4x, a 3x to 4x effect. So the legacy preferences are every bit as large as the racial preferences, if not more. And then the athlete preferences are basically just mechanically, if you're an athlete, you get in. And so, I think if you look in that paper, I think the athlete admit rate is like 86%. And you can kind of break it down by the academic rating. And basically, like, nobody gets in if they have an academic rating of 4 unless they're an athlete. And then maybe 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 applicants gets in if they have an academic rating of 3. But if they're an athlete, it's like a 50-50 chance that they get in. And so you see basically it's like 1,000 times higher rate of admission for the athletes, because if the athletes didn't have that tag that they were athletes, then they just wouldn't get in, period, because they have such low attributes on the other factors that Harvard accounts for. So at UNC, it's going to be even more mechanical. So I think 100% of the athletes get in at UNC, and I think it's that way everywhere. At UNC, for the legacies, there was not very much of a preference, and if there was, it only showed up in the more selective process, which was the out-of-state admission process. But even then, it was a much lower. And I think that's just because Harvard relies a lot on alumni donations, and so they're going to value that legacy status a lot more than a place like UNC that's getting a lot of money from the state government and is able to raise more money from athletics and this type of thing.
Yeah. So do you think that's more about donations of their parents or donations of the students who will then graduate, and eventually those people could be donating? Because I'm trying to think through what else could be playing a role.
Yeah, so I mean, you could rationalize legacy preference even without thinking about donations. For example, at Harvard, they have alumni interview applicants as part of the process. So not only do you have your high school teacher write a letter of recommendation for you, but you need to find a Harvard alum that lives nearby and have an interview with them, and then they grade you on how promising your prospects are to succeed at Harvard. And all of those alumni interviewers basically are volunteers for Harvard, and then they compensate those interviewers by having this legacy advantage in admissions. So it's a little bit of a quid pro quo in terms of if I'm an engaged alumnus or alumna, then I'm going to have my kid has a better chance of getting in, and that's going to motivate me to be more engaged. That's my understanding. So there was actually a document produced as part of the lawsuit that where basically Harvard defended all of its legacy and athlete preferences and donor preferences. So if someone's interested in looking at that document, I can direct you to it. You can just email me. But basically, that's where I'm getting all this information from, is that one document.
Yeah. So how did legacies play a role in the Supreme Court case? Because I know you talked about how that's not a group that is protected constitutionally, right? Necessarily. Yeah. How did that play a role? And was it about the interaction with race, or was it about comparing the effect of being a legacy student relative to the effect of race? How did that?
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, I think the argument, it's been a while since I read all of the Supreme Court ruling, but basically they were saying, well, if you're going to have these preferences for legacies, this is like another thing that you're doing that shouldn't be done, comparing it to the racial preferences. So I think there was basically this comparison, and I think a lot of people feel that way, that there's kind of a connection between racial preferences and legacy preferences, because neither group is sort of being admitted on their merit. I know merit is a loaded word, but Harvard is intentionally setting different bars for admits of different racial groups and admits who are legacy versus not, right? And so that is sort of against American ideals. And if you're discriminating on the basis of legacy background, then that's just as abhorrent as if you're discriminating against someone because of their race or ethnic background. And so I think there's kind of been a movement since the Supreme Court case, or at least leading up to the Supreme Court case. Some universities like Amherst, they did away with their legacy admissions. I think Johns Hopkins did as well. And I think that was meant to be like a political statement, we're going to treat our applicants fairly. And again, fair is a very loaded word, but that's kind of the connection there. So if you're in a world where racial preferences are not allowed, it's going to be more difficult to justify having legacy preferences.
Yeah. And my understanding of the conclusion from the Supreme Court decision then was that race should not be used basically in admissions decisions. Universities can still use that basically as much as they like, right?
So then the only recourse would be some kind of boycott of Harvard. So someone says, well, I don't think that Harvard should be using legacy admissions preferences, so I'm not going to apply to Harvard. But then if you do a little bit of game theory, you can realize that that's not going to be a stable situation, because everyone else is going to say, well, I don't want to necessarily support Harvard's legacy preferences, but I still want to go to Harvard because it'll make me better off in my career. And so, you kind of get into a situation where that's not going to be sustainable for the whole population.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. So sounds like just boycotting Harvard might not work out which is also not how the decision basically the decision to not allow race to affect admissions took place either, right? So it required 10 years or whatever, how many years, many years of, legal dispute.
Yeah. And even then, it's hard to tell if these places are abiding by the Supreme Court ruling. So I have a couple of op-eds with Peter Arcidiacono in City Journal and Chronicle of Higher Ed that came out at the end of 2024, just discussing what we could tell about compliance with the ruling from the published enrollment figures that were coming out. And I think the bottom line is that you're not really going to be able to tell without having the microdata accessible. So when I was applying to colleges, I took the ACT, and I must have maybe it defaulted that they were going to tell me they're going to share my scores with whoever wanted them, or maybe I elected into that. I don't remember. But basically, colleges can buy the names of high-scoring students from College Board or ACT, and then they can use those to send out letters saying, hey, you'd be great if you came to our university. And then that's a way to increase applicants. And I think a lot of this behavior is kind of driven by the college rankings at the US News and World Report. And so universities want to score well on that ranking system because that's going to give them more prestige. And so, all else equal, institutions want more applicants. But they don't want more admits, especially at Harvard. They're not going to change the class size of the admits or the enrollees. And so this gives them an incentive to basically say, hey, send letters to everybody who's even remotely eligible, and then say, hey, you could be a good match for Harvard, and then get them to apply. And then the issue, what we highlighted in that paper is that there was a racial aspect to this, where they seemed to be more aggressively recruiting the Hispanics and the blacks as opposed to the whites or the Asians. And so that basically ended up pumping up their numbers of black and Hispanic applicants. And, you know, there's no evidence that this is true, but there's like circumstantial evidence that this was done so that they could get equal admit rates across all the groups as a way to hide the racial preferences in aggregate data. So this is like another way that an institution could appear to be compliant, appear to be race neutral, but then in actuality, they're basically balancing out their big racial admissions preferences with a lot of basically, we recruited you so that we could reject you. We know, you know, a lot. They're sending letters out to people that have less than 1% chance of getting in based on their grades and test scores. And then, you know, that also highlights a trade-off of like, if I want to diversify my student body, I need to cast a broader net on the recruiting trail. And there's costs and benefits to doing that. And so that's like another way to look at this question.
So because students, when they're applying to universities in general, they're not, you can only apply to so many, even if it was free. So even if they weren't paying anything, you're probably not going to apply to 100 universities. You're going to select which universities you're going to. So if I got a letter from Harvard thinking I'm a good candidate, even though I'm not, that might be one of the universities that I apply to, even though it would be a better fit for me to apply elsewhere. But there's also the financial side of it, which is you often have to pay for those applications, right? So if people are paying for applications to places that they were made to believe that they might be a good fit when they're clearly not, there are a lot of costs, right, that are going to be, and I mean, we're talking about high school students, right? So a lot of these people are not going to have very high incomes. Is that something you guys have thought of as part of this, or has anybody even discussed?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as far as I know, there's a little bit of work on this recruit to reject phenomenon, but not a ton. But I know for sure that, you know, this is an issue, you know, because it creates congestion. It just is very wasteful. You know, obviously, like any one university, it's in their best interest to get more applicants. But then if every university is doing that, then the information that's flooding the market is not credible. And so you're just adding noise to this process that's already noisy. And so, you know, what we recommended is if you could somehow implement a policy where Harvard was forced, or, you know, whatever university was forced to say, okay, someone with your background, your grades and test scores, your extracurriculars, they're going to be admitted to our university with X% probability. And then if you just say that up front, then the kids can still apply. And as long as they know that that they're a long shot, that's fine. But if they don't know that they're a long shot, then that's going to create what economists call welfare loss.
I wonder though if the incentives, so we're economists, so let's think about the incentives that universities have and how that could be effective. So one incentive is you might just want more students in general, right? Because you want your acceptance rate to be lower. And it seems like for as long as we have that incentive, it's going to be hard to get universities to behave very differently. And then another incentive is, well, they might aggressively target one group so that their acceptance rate of that group, you know, things match up. But at least in terms of the first incentive, right? So just getting your acceptance rate to be lower, which if you're going to accept only a given amount of people, the only way for that to happen is for you to get more students. I wonder if there's a way to reduce that incentive, or do you have any?
Yeah, so then that's just like a question of how does society perceive the prestige of universities? And I think that's a harder question to wrap your arms around. But that is the core of the matter. Yeah, because that's a measure. Yeah, that's like a generally accepted measure of prestige is the rankings. And then the fact that at these really highly selective places, the admissions process is zero sum is like another thing you need to think about. So it's tricky for sure.
So your research clearly had an impact in real world decisions, right? And I'm wondering if you think, are there other policy implications, or are there other insights about what we learned about how universities make decisions, how they're thinking about things, that people can take away from your research on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, just the usual econ of there's trade-offs. There's not necessarily a clear solution. It's just what you want to trade off against what is probably one lesson. I think recent work by other academics, so Raj Chetty is a prominent researcher at Harvard. They're looking into sort of what it actually is the effect of going to one of these really highly selective places on your future career trajectory. And so if you want to have like an elite job, you're going to be really helped by going to one of these really top places, what they call an Ivy Plus university. And then, the universities, they have incentives about the income of their enrolled students. So all else equal, if I'm a university, I want to enroll wealthier students because they're going to become wealthier donors in 10 or 20 years. And so there's all those incentives as well. And so I think there's plenty of academic work in this general area of, what causes people to give money to universities, what's the actual value added of a university. I think my take on it is that for most people, they're going to be better off just going to their local public university and doing well. And, if you're excellent, you'll distinguish yourself there. And then you can still, be successful in life. I think actually most Fortune 500 CEOs are not coming from the Ivy Plus. They're coming, a lot of them coming from state schools. And so particularly in the business world, there's a lot of upward mobility even outside of these super selective places. But if you do want to be like a doctor at Brigham and Women Children's Hospital in Boston, you pretty much do have to go to you got to get into a really high-end medical school. And to do that, it seems like going to a really high-end undergrad is going to be helpful for that. So that's kind of what I see as a general takeaway.
Yeah. Tyler, seems like next step might be for you to write a book about all of that. There's just so much insight and a lot of different, angles to examine all of this. Thank you so much for sharing, all of this insight with us. I know I learned a lot. I hope the listeners did as well. Thank you.
I'm very happy to have been on, and thanks again for the invitation.